Okay, cool. So here we go. Let's begin. Here is our boy Madison, our boy James Madison. He's going to
Yeah.
be our one of the main figures we're going to talk about today. Him along with Jefferson and some of the Anti-Federalists. But today we're going to be talking mainly about we're going to be continuing our discussion of John Locke's political philosophy and its impact upon the founding of America. But we're going to be transitioning kind of away from Locke and into like a sort of interlude where we're going to be just playing around with some enduring American controversies that were around from the beginning and are still sort of popping up in different aspects of political life today. This is, of course, an interlude between the sort of modern vision of freedom and the modern economic vision of freedom, which is going to be exemplified by Karl Marx. That'll happen in a couple weeks. But this is our interlude on American controversies. But to remind ourselves where we were last week, we took a look at the Declaration of Independence, and I characterized the Declaration as having four main themes. The first main theme was unalienable rights, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. They cannot be divorced from you. In other words, they're a part of you. You are given to, they are a part that you are equated with your rights. You know, your rights is your property. What's properly yours is another way to say property. It goes along with who you are, right? Nobody can divorce these rights from you. And these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is what Jefferson says. The second main theme is the consent of the governed, right? That governing is by the consent of the governed, which is a major sort of break from tradition. And the language that's used here is that to secure these rights, right? The rights that you can't, the rights are unalienable. They can't be divorced from you, but when they are, it's a problem. And so we have to secure them. That's why we create government, right? To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, right? If the government is not securing these rights, then it's sort of by definition not by the consent of the governed. That is Jefferson's formulation. The third main idea here is the right to revolution. Right there in the Declaration, Jefferson says that wherever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Again, this is Jefferson's words. And then the final idea here, it's a sort of 3B or 3A, right? It's not as important as the other ones, but it is sort of instructive of Jefferson's plan here. And I call it the long train of abuses because that's the language he has. And the idea here is that you can institute a revolution before your rights are being infringed upon if you know for certain that this government wants to interfere with your rights, right? You don't have to wait until it's too late, in other words. And the way that we know that this government is destructive or has designs towards divorcing us from our rights is there will be a long train of abuses. And so this is what he says. He says, a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object, evinces designed to reduce them under absolute despotism. It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. So when we can tell, we can connect the dots, in other words, that we're heading in the direction of tyranny. We're heading in the direction of us being divorced from our rights. We can institute a revolution. We don't have to wait until we are under the the heel of despotism. We can do it before. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is because, of course, we did this last week, is because John Locke gave the idea to Jefferson many centuries before Jefferson wrote the Declaration. Jefferson or Locke's ideas of unalienable rights are right here. And reason, remember, reason teaches all mankind who will but consult it that being equal independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. For men being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker. It's a Christian idea, but like our rights are ours. They're a part of us. It doesn't make sense to talk about somebody who doesn't have rights. Like, your rights is what make you you. It's a part of you, right? This is Locke. And again, the consent of the governed, right, in Locke. No one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living amongst another in a secure enjoyment of their properties. We don't do government. We don't have a government over us unless we consent to it. Now, of course, we did this when we talked about Locke, but like, the main criticism of this idea in Locke of consent is like, I never consented. None of us ever consented to our government, right? We never they never asked us for our consent. But but we give tacit consent on a day-to-day basis. Every action we ever do in our lives, we give tacit consent. We are adhering to this principle right here because we don't revolt against it, because we don't refuse to pay our taxes, things like that. We give tacit consent. This situation is tenable for us, right? As much as we would like to complain about it, we give consent in the way that Locke has in mind. That's the general idea here. Locke gives us the right to revolution that Jefferson borrows, that the American founders borrowed. Whenever, therefore, the legislative shall transgress this fundamental rule of society, endeavor to grasp themselves the lives, liberties, and estates of other people, by this breach of trust, they forfeit the power of the people have put in their hands for quite contrary ends, and it devolves to the people who have a right to resume their original liberty, and by the establishment of a new legislative, provide for their own safety and security, which is the end for which they are in society. Right. And so again, this is that idea we brought up last week, or last time, that it's the government that revolts. It's not us. They have revolted. They have engaged in a revolution by denying us our rights. They're the ones that broke the contract. So it devolves to us the power to sort of create a new one. Right. It's a sort of a passive, reactive form of revolution. It's like the authority to engage in revolution is granted to us, by reflex, right? That's kind of the physics. It's like Locke's like political physics. It's like it's an action and a reaction. The primary mover was the government. The primary mover was the representative, the legislative, as he says here. They are the ones that transgressed. We're not the revolution that we engage in is not a transgression against political society. They have already done so, and so we are simply sort of doing what's natural to us, which is to form a civil political society. And so again, this is what Jefferson and the founders pick up on, or at least that's part of their propaganda, right? And then finally, the reason why I brought up the fourth one, the long train of abuses, is because Locke's language is a long train of usurpations. And it's just sort of shameless plagiarism at this point. Revolutions happen not upon every little mismanagement of public affairs, great mistakes in the ruling part, many wrong and inconvenient laws, all the slips of human frailty will be borne by the people without immunity or murmur. But if a long train of abuses, provocations, artifices, all tending in the same way, make the design of visible to the people, 'tis not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves and endeavor to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was at first created or erected. And so again, it's just sort of like shameless. It's like that's one way to describe the United States Declaration of Independence. It's like a shameless plagiarism. And so it's just sort of funny to sort of say that. But sort of, the reason why we do this, this sort of concludes Locke for us, right? And so Locke sort of gives us citizenship as watchful vigilance against government. This is Locke's form of civil. So the best citizen in Locke, to be a good citizen, is to be watchfully vigilant against your government. Is to, certainly take your time, take your own import of your life. The importance of your life is on your own, designs, your own property, your own securement of your own pleasure, right? But keep a sort of half-opened eye on government. A good citizen will do that, because what you're doing then is you're making sure the government is doing what it's supposed to do, which is protecting your rights. That is the extent of citizenship in Locke, right? It's not to be a part. It's not to be a part of government. It's not to sort of represent yourself. It's not to be knowledgeable about anything in particular. It's to just keep a watchful vigilance to make sure you're not being infringed upon, and to be at the ready to engage in revolution when your rights are being infringed upon. And so that's the extent of good citizenship in Locke, which is, of course, night and day from Aristotle, right? Which is, Aristotle's like, being a good citizen is being a good person, right? the only purpose of being a good person is to be a good citizen. That's like the whole purpose of life. Freedom for Locke is non-interference. It's a materialist freedom. Remember, it's the negative freedom. It's not a positive freedom. It's not the freedom to do something. It's the freedom from interference. Negative. It's a negative type of freedom. It's lacking interference. You're free to do as you wish, do as you will, but if you can't do something, it's that doesn't mean you're not free to do it, or that it just means you don't have the ability to, or something like that, right? That's the sort of negative idea. And so this is, we will see that sort of contrasted, but it's kind of similar to Marx's idea of freedom. We'll see it. It's actually a pretty similar type of freedom that Marx constructs, in that they're both materialist. They both don't conceive of freedom as a civic activity in the way that we had to construct with Aristotle. Remember, I had to sort of convince you guys that Aristotle's idea of freedom had something to do with politics, had something to do with like being a political being. It was sort of a strange idea. Marx isn't going to share any of that. Marx is going to agree with Locke that freedom is quite literally just the movement of your body, right? And whether or not you're being interfered with. He will have a different idea than Locke in particular, but he will agree that it is materialist, not civic. And we also, in our discussion of Locke's ideas on property, we found that for Locke, economics and freedom are a very similar, they're a very similar type of word. Economics overlaps with freedom is the way that I formulate it. You can't really talk about freedom without talking about economics. You can't talk about economics without talking about freedom. You engage in freedom through your economic activity. But it is a distinctly capitalist form of economics, in that he is not really going to be concerned about your ability to engage in the market. He's more concerned with your lack, with making sure that there is no restrictions in the negative sense for you to engage in the market. And he certainly would be against any sort of structures that prevent people from acquiring their property, provided they don't allow it to go to spoilage. Remember that whole thing? So anyway, so that's the sort of idea of Locke here. Hopefully it reminds you of where we were. It'll be helpful coming up here. So again, let's turn to the American controversies. I think we'll do these over the next 2 weeks. There's kind of 2 different lectures here. The first lecture will deal with these figures that we have up here. We have Jefferson, Madison, George Clinton, who we think is Cato. I'm actually not remembering my slide here. Who else is in here? And then next week we'll have Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and then Eugene Debs will actually bring us right into Marx, which will be fun. Right. So Hamilton is the guy I'm forgetting, of course. Hamilton, Madison, Cato, Jefferson. And the reason I have Hamilton here, not because we're going to read anything specifically by Hamilton, but Hamilton, along with Madison, wrote the Federalist Papers, right? And so the Federalist Papers are going to be exemplifying a particular perspective of American republicanism, which will be contrasted by Cato and Jefferson, who are our anti-federalist figures. And so today we're going to focus on the American constitutional design. We're setting aside the Declaration, we're moving to the Constitution. And one of the main sort of controversies, one of the main things that we had to sort of figure out when we were sitting down to write the Constitution, is whether or not a large republic like the one that was kind of being designed was going to be feasible. Because for the history of republicanism, the history of democracy, really, up until now, the wisdom associated with it has always been something like you have to have a really small group of people that are all homogeneous. They all look alike. They all think alike. They're one city state, for example, right? You can't have a republic the size of Greece. You have to have a republic the size of Athens. That was the kind of thought, you know. And so in the foment of the American Revolution, during the failure of the Articles of Confederation, this question arises again. Can we have a republic? Can we have a unified republic the size of the 13 colonies, or the first 13 states under the Articles of Confederation? This was a major discussion. This was a major debate. A lot of people had differing views upon this, and this was the political debate of the time, right? Which was quickly replaced by the question of slavery. But this debate between the sizes of republics, what is feasible, this is what we're going to be talking about. And so picking up the mantle for large republics, the fact that we can have a large republic, will be Hamilton and Madison. And they write the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are a series of basically newspaper articles, published in the major newspapers of the time, written under pseudonyms that were designed to convince the states to ratify the Constitution, because the Constitution had already been drafted at the Philadelphia Convention, and they were sent to the states. The states had to sign off on them in order for us to become a country. And so we had to convince the states to do it, right? Or at least Hamilton and Madison felt it was upon them to do it. And so they sit down and write a bunch of these articles, a bunch of these newspaper articles saying, like, look how great of an idea this is. Look at this wonderful passage in the Constitution that deals with the judges. Look at this wonderful passage that deals with insert idea here. Isn't this such a wonderful idea? And what we didn't have time to explain to you when you're writing the Constitution is look at this history. This is the reason why we wanted to do it this way, et cetera, et cetera. And so these Federalist Papers end up being collected, and they're read now. They're collected into a book, published, in various ways. We call them the Federalist Papers, but they were propaganda, right? They were, as most of these things are, one of the most effective pieces of propaganda, but propaganda nonetheless. And then we have what we call now today the Anti-Federalist Papers, were the same sort of thing, but on the other side. Much less focus and sort of, actually, there's a lot less coverage of them, or there's a lot less interest in them today. But the Anti-Federalist Papers will have an example of them from Cato and Jefferson as well.
Can you just do a 2-sentence recap of what the Federalist Papers said? I'm a little lost.
Well, they said 120 different things.
Okay.
There's a bunch of them, right? So Hamilton writes like 70 or something of them. Okay. Madison writes 50 something. John Jay writes 3 famously. But they all say different things. And so we're going to look at the 10th one. The 10th Federalist 10 is the most famous one, written by Madison. And
Okay.
it exemplifies a lot of it. Like it's the same kind of idea, but they all focus on different stuff, right? A lot of them are about the judiciary. A lot of them are about the presidency. A lot of them are about the legislature. A lot of them are about foreign policy. It's just like, look, the Constitution is a good idea. That's the sentence, right? I could do it in one sentence. The Federalist Papers say the Constitution is a good idea. That's the sentence. Anyway, so Hamilton and Madison, they are offering us the extended republic thesis. And the extended republic can exist. In fact, there are distinct advantages to it. Yet the meaning of freedom and citizenship will be transformed, right? So the role of representation becomes much more prominent. So if we remember back to our discussion about Aristotle, right? You can imagine why Aristotle would say something like, you have to have a small republic, right? Because for Aristotle, being a human being means going to take part in politics, means going to this town square and talking with your homies and deciding how the water's going to get to your homes and where the sewage line is going to go. And, that's what being a human being is for Aristotle. In a large republic like the type that Hamilton and Madison want to create, we can't all get together and decide those sorts of things, right? We need to sort of we need to engage in representation. We need to transform our ideas of freedom and citizenship away from the ancient idea. And so we'll talk about that. And then again, like I said, I should have brought this slide up earlier. Cato and Jefferson will tell us something like, something is going to be lost with an extended republic. When we expand the republic too far, we're going to lose something essential is going to be lost when we have too grand of a physical space to sort of engage with it. And so we'll see what they have to say about that. So again, let's talk about Madison's Federalist 10. I'm just going to move along here. Federalist 10 focuses on the problem of faction. Faction is the word that Madison uses to describe something that he thinks is a big problem. And so let's figure out what he has to say about this. And so he says, by faction, I understand a number of citizens. This is his definition of faction. I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interest of the community. So having read that or having heard me say that, what do you guys have in mind? What is this? What do you like? What does this bring to mind to you? Any like examples?
Can you say that? Can you say that again? I was listening, but just help me digest it.
Yeah, so he says, by faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So a group of people who have an interest, a shared interest,
Sure.
and they are against the interest of some other group or of everybody.
So he's putting like there's an inherent negative connotation.
Yes, we are against these things. Faction is a problem.
Okay, it's not
faction
like,
is a problem.
So faction to him, faction's not just like this is a political organization. This is like a harmful group of I don't know, bigots or something.
Yeah, so like immediately what I have in mind is like
I immediately think of like Antifa. I like think of Antifa as like a faction.
Okay, I disagree. on the level, I disagree with you, but I agree that that's a good example, provided you come from a certain type of persuasion. But somebody else could say like anti-LGBTQ.
Sure, for sure.
It's usually the idea is like it's like we're worried about people getting too much power, because when you amass a large enough amount of people, you get that, right? You get a certain amount of power, but they are sort of like they're gonna be damaging to our political community, And so sometimes people just say like parties, but sometimes people say political parties is a faction.
Well, initially my first reaction was like, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, but then I have to imagine that by definition, like those parties aren't supposed to be harmful, right? I think there's a strong argument that both of those parties are very harmful today, but
Yeah.
they're not intended to be, right? Versus like Antifa or Joanna said, the KKK, like they're very much by definition both harmful organizations.
Yeah. So yeah, it's not helpful for us to get into the weeds of like deciding who and what's a faction as far as like, you know, different groups. I think the KKK is a wonderful example. I don't have a problem with saying political parties are an example. In fact, George Washington is like probably the most famous example of somebody who would say a political party is just a fucking faction. His farewell address after he leaves office is something like, do not form a political party. You guys do not form political parties. That's what he says on the way out. Because there weren't any really political parties. Like they were like groups that were for Washington's administration and groups that were against his administration. And he, on his way out, he said, do not formulate any sort of groupings around these sorts of things. Find other ways to associate with each other or disassociate with each other. Do not form political parties. And then right away there's like a group that there's the you know, foundation, there's like the administrative pro-administrative people and like this sort of anti whatever. It ends up sort of happening right away.
Was that something that was like a holdup? Like, where did that come from? Was that like them bringing it over from Britain? Was that like a unique, like, I don't, obviously I'm retarded when it comes to history, but like where did that concept come from? And why was it introduced so quickly when Washington was so against it?
Well, so Madison will give us a sort of theoretical example or a theoretical answer to why people form what he calls faction, but we could sort of extend it and say why we end up with political parties. There's a bunch of like modern political science research into association and like belonging and things like that, and like why it might be sort of satisfactory to you to be a part of a political party. There certainly was a history of it before America's founding. Yeah, Britain had major political parties. Some of my favorite like actual like capital S science, political science, is about how when you have a system set up in the way that we do, which is like what we call single member district plurality, we elect one representative per district. When you have that type of system, you only can have two parties. Only can have two parties. Everybody always complains about how we only have two parties. So my favorite research in that like sort of political science, capital S, says that, well, you can only have two political parties when you have your type of elections. When you go to Europe, they have you know, first past the post. They have parliamentary style systems where you can have like 7 viable political parties, but we only have 2, not because we want to, but because that's the only way we end up. It only ends up working out that way. It's too complicated for me to explain right now, but in general, I think my quickest answer to your question is like, everybody was a really sort of was a fan. Everybody either was a fan of Washington's administration or they fucking hated it. And so it just coalesced naturally because those two groups created their own campaigns for the next election, right? Washington's Vice President Adams won, and then you know that same idea happened again for 8 years later with Jefferson, right? And then finally the anti-administrative, you know, Jefferson was the first president from the sort of anti-Washington group. And then it's been that way since. It's the first, you know, political division as far as like presidential elections was about whether you were a fan of Washington or not. A little bit more complicated than that, but that's the general idea. So anyway, faction. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Derek.
I was going to say, so it's almost easy for Washington to say that because he was the first one. there was no one before him. And
Yeah.
then it makes it really easy for the people coming after him. They're like, well, I'm just going to disagree with him because that'll get everybody who's against him on my side. Like it just manifested
That's
itself
a good
just
point.
by the way that it was
Dude.
created.
Washington's a fraud, dude. That's such a good point. That dude was just like, yeah, I'm fucking holier than thou. Don't form factions. But it's because he was already on top. What a bitch.
I love it. Okay, so Federalist 10, the 10th Federalist paper written by Madison.
What?
What do you mean what?
What was the last comment made in this channel?
We were talking about our first president, George Washington, and about how he told us that we shouldn't have political parties. And Derek says that's really convenient. You got elected, without a political party. And we just were having fun talking shit on that position. But you guys should read his farewell address. President Washington's farewell address. It's pretty fun. Anyway, so Madison, let's adopt the Constitution, he says in Federalist 10. But in Federalist 10, he says there's a problem. Problems in republics is that they tend to faction. When you have freedom, when we're giving people the freedom that we want them to have, they're going to join with each other and create divisions between other groups. They're all going to have their particular interests, and it's going to cause problems in our republic. And so he has in Federalist 10, he has a series. He has 5 two-pronged arguments. That's the sort of Federalist 10 is 5 times 2. 5 two-pronged arguments. That's how you get to 10. That's not why it's called 10, but whatever. The first two-pronged argument, the first argument is that there's 2 ways to cure faction. 1, you can remove its causes. Or, second, you can control its effects. The second two-pronged argument, there are 2 ways to remove the causes. 1, you can destroy liberty. 2, or you can homogenize the citizenry. We don't want to do any of those, don't we? So let's get rid of this idea of removing the causes. And let's say, what are the 2 ways to control the effects? Because it's going to have to be something like that, right? The 2 ways to control the effects of faction is that 1, we can obstruct interest, or 2, we can obstruct concert, meaning like the ability to get together, not like obstruct having a concert, like a musical concert. The fourth two-pronged argument. There are 2 differences between a democracy and a republic. The first difference is among their representation systems. The second is their territorial scope. The fifth two-pronged argument. There are 2 ways large territories actually improve republics, contrary to Montesquieu and Aristotle and all you former critics of large republics. Large republics are good, actually. First reason is that it improves the quality of representatives. And second, it's harder to form factious majorities. Okay, so that's the entire argument in skeletal form. Let's break it down a little bit closer. So like I said, there are 2 ways to cure the problems of faction. First, we can remove their causes, or we can control their effects. So let's consider how to remove the causes. We can destroy liberty or homogenize the citizenry. So destroying the liberty essential to the existence of faction. So it's a sort of natural cause and effect. When you have liberty, you will end up with faction. That's the problem. We could have a sort of a despotic government. That's what Madison is sort of like, he's just going through like a logic here, right? And so he's saying like, look, one of the ways we can get rid of factions, which we all want to do, is we could just make sure you guys can't leave your homes or talk amongst yourselves on any topic, on any topic that's not on this list that we'll send around, That's one way to make sure you guys don't form factions. The other way to make sure you guys don't form factions is to make sure you guys all look and talk and think and breathe and exist exactly the same as everybody else. You guys all have the same interests.
Just to jump in here.
Yeah. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Brian. It's great to be here, I gotta say. This is starting to sound like fucking North Korea, the more you describe to me faction proposal number 10 here, which is ironic coming from somebody who wrote the Constitution.
Well, he's being funny right now because what he's going to do is say that these are all, obviously we don't want to do this.
Okay, cool.
He's like shocking you into like paying attention, I think.
Well,
That's kind of like what he's saying. He's like, look, guys, we could do this. But then he's going to say, but like, he's doing it sort of like in a facetious, I can't say that word, facetious sort of way where he's like, do you want us to do that? No? Oh, okay. Well, then we'll do something else then. Because look, he says, destroying liberty is an absurd solution. Homogenizing the citizenry is an impracticable one. Did I say that right? Diversity is inevitable. Diversity is especially inevitable when it comes to acquisition of property, right? And so the reason why 2 is such a problem for Madison and for the rest of the founders is we're trying to create a republic that allows for the free acquisition or the free ability, right, to acquire and pursue property accumulation. And so if we're going to homogenize you guys all, that would include sort of making sure we all have the same amount of property. And that's like a big no-no, right? Immediately.
No.
Right. And so that this is supposed to just be like automatic in our heads. Like, oh, of course these options are not reasonable, you know? So this is, in fact, this is what he has to say. Regarding property and faction. He says, those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society, distinct meaning separate, right? The poor among us and those of us who own property, we're not going to see eye to eye. And so if we're trying to form a republic that has both of us in it, we're going to have a problem, aren't we? That's what he means by faction, is like what he has in mind, what we've tried to construct, and what he actually has in mind is you know, Joanna says the KKK. What he really is worried about is poor people. That's the faction that he's worried about. Because if those people get enough power, and look, they're more populous than us, right? They're 70, 80, 90% of the population are people without property. If they get the power that we're going to say that they have equal to us, they're going to take away our property, aren't they? They're going to distribute it. They're going to like claim it and distribute it. And so we have to make sure this doesn't happen. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. That's what he has in mind by faction. People are going to have distinct and different amounts of property, right? Or relations to the ability to acquire wealth, right? As Marx might say, you know, your relations to the means of production are going to be different. Some of us are going to have different relationships to the means of production. But the takeaway of this, the takeaway point for purposes of Madison's argument is that the latent causes of faction are thus sown into the nature of man. That it is in our nature.
Of what? Of faction?
Yes.
Okay, what does faction mean? Sorry.
Oh, Maverick. Faction is this discussion
Wait,
that
are
we
you
had from the
fucking
very
joking
beginning.
right now?
No, I'm sorry. I'm being
Faction
Bro, we
is this-
literally just spent the last fucking 30 minutes describing and defining that. That's literally all we've talked about for the entire. I'm like
Really?
personally offended.
What are you I
Because
feel like
every other person in
the
here has
two-prong-
fucking
the
engaged
two-
in the conversation
the
and
two-pronged
contributed something, and that's the
approach,
dumbest question I've ever heard.
So the
Dude.
two-pronged argument. So the 5 two-pronged arguments
Yeah.
are all about what we're going to do about faction. Because look, we're starting a republic here, and we have a big problem because not everybody agrees about everything, don't they?
Okay.
And if we're going to give them the ability to vote, and we're going to give them the ability to associate with each other, we want them to have freedom, and we're going to let them have property too if they like are able to acquire it. We're going to have a problem if the wrong
Yeah, okay, I
people
got it.
get the wrong kinds of problem. If poor people get too much power, we're in trouble, right?
Mhm. Okay.
By
all right.
faction, he has in mind groups of people adverse to the interests of
Right.
others.
Horde versus
Faction.
alliance in
Yeah.
terms
Okay,
you'd
okay.
understand.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
but
that's all I was asking. That's all I was
Right.
asking. If
And
it was
so-
a different was he using it differently than to describe a sect or a faction of people? That's all I was. Because
yeah,
the way he uses it, he said faction as if it is a
it's a technical term for him. It's different than the way that we would say like a faction of like a RTS video game.
That's what I was asking. Yeah,
It's
He's
kind of
saying-
it's
he's
a
using it as
subgroup.
as an action word almost.
It's a technical term is the way that I would say. Like it's a subgroup that's adverse to the interests of everybody else. And so like but so the important part here is that factions are the latent causes of faction are sewn into the nature of man. Because we are naturally free, remember these are these types of people that like we have this freedom born into us. This is our rights. And because we're forming a government to guarantee it, we are gonna form a government that is gonna allow them to pursue faction, right? And so this is a problem, right? And so we can't remove the causes. We've already discussed this. Jeff says it sounds like North Korea to remove the causes. We can't do that. Madison agrees. So we have to control the effects. So controlling the effects of faction is the central question of Republican political science. Controlling the effects, as Madison says, the first way to do it is to prevent the existence of the same passion or interest in populace. So the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority must be prevented. So the factious majority must be kept from acting in consort and carrying into effect their schemes of oppression. So these are also sort of like not great things. It's not great ideas, right? Or
Bro.
not great sort of. What's up?
Does this dude define like does he give us any definitions of what sort of organized action he does approve of? Because obviously I get the definition of the faction, but this all seems to bleed really heavily over into like any organization of a group, like a workers union or a
Yeah, we don't want those.
a
Why would we want those? Those suck, right? They take
Hey,
away property.
now.
No, but I'm just saying I get what you're doing there, but I'm just does he create any space for any sort of organized activity at all, or is it all a faction?
I feel like all of this is kind of like guaranteed or your money back to create the Constitution. I feel like all of this is saying, does that make sense what I'm saying there? Like we're gonna create all of these. You can have a revolution if this shit gets too crazy for you, I promise. That's what I feel like it is. Like it's all what I'm saying is the idea of what an organized government looks like has already been said, I'm guessing. And now he's saying, but don't trip. Here's all the ways in which we can prevent it from getting out of hand. Is that right, Brian? I feel like that's what.
So the context of Federalist 10 is really just in conversation with Montesquieu and so like this long history of writings and thought on this large republic idea. And I haven't really gotten there yet with this, but like what Madison's doing is saying like, look, you guys are also worried about factions, right? But look, because we're making such a large republic, the reason that you guys are afraid of a large republic, but look, the larger republic is going to solve this faction problem that you're more worried about. We have never done a large republic in the history of the world. We've only ever done small republics. We did one in Athens. We did one, they've tried a couple in France. There's other, examples that he brings up, but they're all small and they all don't work. And you guys are all talking shit all the time about large republics and it's going to be too unwieldy and whatever. But what I'm saying, I'm Madison, what I'm saying is that the large republic's actually going to solve this other problem, solve this problem of faction, which is the reason why republics fail in the first place. Athens fell because of faction, and he goes through this long history of like other small republics that fall because a small group of people get too much power and they become despots, right? It's usually the poor people is what they say, right? And so again, like what he has in mind is the poor people. That's kind of what that's really what is forefront center. We have to make sure the poor people are not going to be able to carry out what they want to do, which is to redistribute the property, right? We have to make sure they don't string us up by our toenails, So one way to do that is to get rid of everybody's liberty. The other way to do that is to control the effects, is to make sure that they don't act in concert with each other, right? Make sure that they make sure that they don't think the same way. And these are all not really going to work, right? You can't control the causes or the effects of faction. But what he does have in mind here is to again sort of reintroduce this idea of a republic and how it's going to be different than the type of democracy that causes or the small republic that causes the factions to be ruinous. The delegation of government to representatives, right? That is a feature of republicanism that is distinct from democracy, or at least what Madison is trying to say. The other example of what republicanism is, or republics are versus democracies, like the greater number of citizens and the greater sphere over country over which government may be extended. And so he's saying what he has. So the small republic, he kind of lumps that into a democracy is a small republic. A large republic is just republic. That's just kind of his like shorthand, the way he's sort of describing it. But the kicker here, and I've told you guys a couple times this, but the way that he sort of concludes this is he says that the large republic, the large territory that we're going to create, will improve the quality of the republic for a couple of reasons, but it's going to make it harder to form a factious majority. The factions in a large republic are going to become so numerous. There's going to be a million factions in a large republic, like there is today, right? We have a number of examples that we had in mind when we were coming up with examples of what a faction is. But they're going to become so numerous and so cross purposes, they're going to eat each other. They're going to fight each other rather than fighting everybody else, right? So the property lists of one, they're going to form a union in a particular company rather than a countrywide union, right? Can you guys imagine that? So like if we had a small republic, if we had a republic the size of a city and 10% of the workforce all worked for the same company, a union that size would be a big problem for that city, wouldn't it? Because they would go on strike and all of a sudden we can't function. But a union the size of Blizzard goes on strike or whatever, nobody cares on a countrywide level. The size of the republic then actually allows for factions to not be a problem, essentially. That's the idea here. That's what he ends up saying. The extended geographical orbit, the larger numbers of parties and interests, these factions cannot form a majority and steer our country in the wrong direction. We will thus be a configuration. We will be the conjoining of hundreds of thousands of millions of different factions, all vying for power, but all fighting each other. And out of that conflict comes a general sort of stability. That's the
Hey,
idea.
Brian, just quick timeline question
Yeah.
for you about how far after the Constitution was this written?
So this is before the Constitution was even ratified,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
Well, it was ratified, but it was sent to the states. So this is during the debate whether or not we should let this document that came out of the Philadelphia Convention be our government. The history of that is like the Articles of Confederation failed, which was like the first government we tried, which was basically just states. We had 13 states, and they weren't really together. So it wasn't a country. 13 countries. And it sucked because one of there was a big there was like a riot in one of the states, and we couldn't raise a militia. We couldn't ask for help from another country. We couldn't create trade deals with other countries. Every single state had their own economy. Could we mint a national currency? Like we didn't have a country. And so it didn't work. And so so they all went to Philadelphia to decide to ratify or to alter the Articles of Confederation, our first government. We all sent them there. And then instead of doing that, they committed treason and they formed a new government. And then they came back and said, look, we have a better one. Let's ratify it. And then that's what we're doing now. There's debates. People are writing articles in the newspaper. Look, it's a good idea. The 10th Federalist paper is the one that we're talking about now. And it's trying to convince us, look, you guys wanted a small state republic. You guys wanted states the size of Connecticut, a country the size of Connecticut. But look, if we make it a large one, if you make it the size of the entire seaboard, eastern seaboard, it's going to be better. Because we're not like when one company's workers decides to like take control of the factory, it's not going to cause a national emergency because we'll have much more of territory and population to be able to handle these sorts of things. That's the general argument of Federalist 10. Okay. So finishing Federalist 10, the influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration to the other states. Just restating things that I've already said. You can have a localized problem in a large republic, and it won't threaten the whole republic, right? So factions, he's sort of embracing factions. He understands there's nothing we can really do about it except extend factions to everybody. Make sure everybody can be a part of a faction, because then nobody is going to have a factious majority. Nobody's going to be able to have a faction that is large enough to take full control over the designs of government and of power. So he throws overboard ancient conceptions of both citizenship and liberty. Works of politics is delegated to the elites for Madison. And Madison thinks that's a good thing. Right? Large republics are designed to actually prevent concentrated action among citizens, meant to disperse the power of the demos. Freedom and citizenship are still enjoyed, but in the negative sense, through the election of representatives and the general reign of negative liberty throughout the republic. Madison's revolutionary position, overthrowing centuries of conventional wisdom, which says that liberty can only exist in a small republic, ends up being like what we think of when we think of politics, right? We tend to think of like the sort of passive, reading of articles, watching the news, right? It's not about action anymore, right? And so the way that we have sort of engaged in our political lives and is very much indebted to Madison, for better or for worse. Cato, turning now to the Anti-Federalist position, Cato gives a voice to the centuries of conventional wisdom that Madison overthrows. Cato's name, we think, is George Clinton. Cato is a pseudonym. There was an article written and the pseudonym was Cato, who's like a Roman guy, but we think it's George Clinton, who's the first governor of New York, not the member of Parliament or Funkadelic, but as the first governor of New York. And he quotes Montesquieu. And let me see if I can find it, because I think it's pretty good. 110. Any questions so far? I'm going to try and hurry through the last bit here. Where am I? Is it here? Oh, it's not there, is it? Give me a second. Okay, here we go. Okay, here we go. So this is the kicker for Cato. So again, remember, this is an anti-federalist position. He's trying to argue against Madison and against Hamilton. Hamilton and Madison both want the large republic. Let's approve the Constitution, etc. Cato says, no, let's have the country the size of the states, much smaller republics. It's going to be better, etc. He says this: whoever seriously considers the immense extent of territory comprehended within the limits of the United States, together with a variety of its climates, productions, and commerce, the difference of extent and number of inhabitants in all, the dissimilitude of interests, morals, and policies in almost every one, it will receive it as an intuitive truth that a consolidated republican form of government therein can never form a perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, promote the general welfare. This is quoted from the Constitution, and secure the blessings of liberty to you and your posterity. So he's pretty funny. He says, like, look, it's so big that we will never do the quote, form a perfect union, establish justice, which is pretty funny. This unkindred legislature, therefore, composed of interests opposite and dissimilar in their nature, will in its exercise emphatically be like a house divided against itself. So in a large republic, commercial prosperity gives rise to ambition. Hamilton and Madison aim at commercial prosperity, the cultivation of private wealth. A small republic can guard against it. Public interest is more easily perceived, more easily prevails over private interest. And so based on Montesquieu, who's somebody, he ends up quoting Montesquieu later. So this is like the inherited wisdom of the small republic idea. To a republic to only have a small territory, otherwise it cannot long subsist. In a large one, there are men of large fortunes, and consequently of less moderation. There are too great deposits to interest in the hands of a single subject. An ambitious person soon becomes sensible that he may be happy, great, and glorious by oppressing his fellow citizens, and that he might raise himself to grandeur on the ruins of his country. In large republics, the public good is sacrificed to 1,000 views. In a small one, the interest of the public is easily perceived, better understood, and more within the reach of every citizen. Abuses have less extent and, of course, are less protected. So that's pretty convincing, isn't it? Right? So like Cato quotes Montesquieu, quotes the old French guy, and says, look, in a large republic, we're not going to see each other as equal partners in this endeavor. We're going to see each other as like threats to our prosperity. We're going to feel like we can impose ourselves upon you, upon our fellows, because look, you're not my neighbor. You live 7 towns over. You live 7 states over. I don't care about you. I'm gonna steal your property. I'm not gonna see you as my partner in our political shared life. That's the idea, the Montesquieuian idea of the small republic and why it's better. And so again, based on Montesquieu, Cato argues against the adoption of the Constitution. Is Cato right? You know, like, so does any of this hit you guys on any sort of level? You guys used to talk, you guys have spoken to me in previous weeks about how you, like, how can we form a country with each other when we have different opinions? Like, if there's a city that's, you know, Athens and Sparta, for example, how could they be, you know, that's the sort of like ancient idea of the small republic, that you can't, those are not our brothers, you know?
It was pretty something.
I mean, I think that you're explaining
Yeah, it's not very good singer to me.
as close as we're gonna get, or this is the first, well, I guess, is this the modern version of that? And it's the closest that we're gonna get, I guess. If you're asking for my opinion,
No,
I hope one day the entire earth can be under something like this, but Howard and I always,
Yeah, so that's
Argue about-
Madison. So Madison says you can do the entire earth. It doesn't matter if we're different than each other, as long as we sort of formulate it in a way in which nobody can acquire for themselves the ability to sort of dominate others, have
But
their interests.
isn't he proving that argument by saying that we'll be so divided that it won't be possible? Like it just seems like a back-asswards way of like proving your argument. Like, no, don't worry. The division's actually going to be so big that it
Yeah.
won't matter. It's not actually bringing people together. It's increasing the amount of division in
Yeah.
exponential numbers so that it's irrelevant. And like, I just think that's kind of bullshit. Like, I don't know. Like, it just
Hell yeah.
doesn't seem like a good solution or even a good argument to just.
I love
to
that
just-
for you, Jeff. Because that's what Cato says. Cato says that's going to be like a house divided against itself. We can never form a perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. What are you talking about, Madison? We're going to be too divided. Yeah.
Yeah, Madison's on some bullshit.
I was just commenting on the side with Joanna about this. Like, I already knew that this country was like formed by rich white people to protect rich white people, but like your explanation of like all the states going to Philadelphia, drafting all this shit and being like, hey, we got a better idea. We're gonna
Yeah.
like shove all this shit in their face, and then they'll all be fighting each other, and we're good.
Yeah.
Like, it's fucked up, dude. Like, I'm with Cato on this 100%. Like, it's like totally mess. I just see it now. This is all stuff I didn't know, you know, like I knew, but I didn't know the specifics, and it's like making a lot more sense now. So anyway, thank
That's
you.
cool as hell, man. There's going to be some other discussion opportunities in a second here, but so to, you know, Madison.
well, hold on, sorry.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to add in here one more time that the whole reason all of this is coming about is because of a profit motive. And
Okay.
I think the real benefit and of having a country or a republic is that these independent states, these independent bodies, don't necessarily have to profit off of one another's work. Like, I really relate with the American Revolution. You know what I'm saying? Like, they didn't want to be putting a percentage of their hard work into someone else's pocket. And that's why all of this is coming about. And I bet that was it wasn't just like, you're not my neighbor, you're way over there. It was like, why would I let you profit off of my grain production and my tobacco sales?
Here's the
and all
deal.
this
I
shit?
don't understand, like, not to like derail us completely, but I don't understand how you can say what you just said and personally relate to that concept, yet you talk shit to me when I have an issue with paying taxes or I don't want the IRS funding to. No, I'm serious. I'm genuinely trying to understand it, because to me, I feel the exact same way about the IRS and about paying into all these fucking social services and all these other things. When I see 45% of my paycheck disappear every month, I feel the same way that the colonists did when their grain I'm serious, and I knew you were gonna laugh when I said that, but it's like it feels the same to me. My money is being taken by people that I didn't elect and being spent on things I don't believe in, and I have no say in it, and it's done completely irrespective of how I feel about it. And so I guess hearing such a passionate argument from you, Maverick, that I 100% personally relate to, I'm curious why what I just said doesn't resonate, but what you just said does resonate. Like, what's the difference between?
I have a really good answer for you. One, the colonists were paying not just one, they were paying a royalty to an entire different country. So it would be as if you were paying the United States government, and then on top of them was another dude fucking you. That's my answer to it. So what I'm saying is that you were the colonist saying, I don't want my grain sales or my tobacco sales going to my neighbor, right? You were saying that, but then in this situation, on top of that would be another company of people taking another percentage before you were even splitting.
I think that's the difference, is that I don't feel like I'm saying I don't want my profit going to my neighbor. I'm saying I don't want my profit going to another external company. And I think that's the difference, is that I look at the power structures in California, specifically in the United States in general, as like an external company that's taking from me. And you look at them as your neighbor versus.
I do. That's correct.
Yeah, that makes more sense. Okay, so that's the difference right there.
That's correct, because no, I hear what you're saying though, and the truth is there is a very fine line between that. You know, like you could argue that, I don't know. I have a lot of issues with the UN and the money that is kind of dealt with, how money is dealt with the UN, and you could make that same argument. I could make the same argument you're making right now, and so
no,
yeah.
But your answer makes sense though.
Maverick is right. You're driving into a dead zone, so I'm gonna talk over you.
In any case, my point is, that makes a lot of sense, Maverick. That answers my question. I think that's just the fundamental like difference in perception that we have on that.
Cool. Love that. One thing that I think is being lost in that discussion was how the colonists really were receiving no benefit whatsoever for the taxes that they were paying. There was only a sort of standing army that was like harassing them. There wasn't any, and then you could say that there was a sort of like protection against native populations, but like there wasn't on a day-to-day level, there wasn't any sort of threat. And I mean, so anyway, it doesn't really matter, but like, California offers. I mean,
I could argue the same. I hear you, and I know that this is like getting into hyperbole, but I could argue the same thing, that I don't benefit from it.
There will be several weeks where we're gonna do Marxism and taxation, and it'll be really fun.
If it makes you feel any better, I also don't agree about where my taxes are spent. I disagree with you about the first part a little bit, but I super agree with you about. I think that we should definitely have more say over where they go.
Yeah, just to be very clear, I do believe in paying tax. I know I like to fuck with you guys a lot, but I absolutely believe in paying taxes, and I absolutely believe in there being like some level of government. Yeah, I do. Okay. And I believe in there being some level of a government. I believe there being some level of government safety net and some social services. I just think we've long crossed that line of excess.
I fucking agree with you 100% there, bro. Honestly,
I'm gonna jump
in. Add in over military. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Hi guys. So I'm gonna counter that point, Howard, and say I think the reason why we have so many taxes and so many regulations and so many programs and all this and all this and all this, that makes people legitimately concerned about whether tax money is going, if it's being spent properly and everything else. But here's the thing, we wouldn't need to spend all that money on those programs if the tax brackets were appropriate to the amount of money that people actually take home. And if employers just actually paid people fair wages that went up with the cost of inflation, which is a completely different thing that also needs to be regulated. But all of this stuff that we're talking about, like, it all kind of theoretically worked and it was fine in some aspects until Reagan became president in the 80s and slashed a bunch of stuff. So there's people like me whose only recourse to get paid a good wage for their work and not be burnt out and have every little bit of their labor essentially be underpaid is to form a union, right? So when we talk about the social safety nets, we wouldn't have a need to fund them as much as we do if companies were taking care of their employees, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
No, and I think I agree. While I vehemently disagree with a number of things that you said, I strongly agree with a couple of things that you said, that being one of them. No, I do. I think you're right. I think the fact that so many of our industries have to rely on collective bargaining is really sad. And that, but I guess I think the genesis of that problem is probably somewhere different than where you believe is. Whereas I believe that perhaps it's excess regulation that causes that, as opposed to not enough. But I agree in the necessity. I do agree with you in terms of the necessity of collective bargaining with the state that we are now. And I also agree.
Good news. The next like 3 weeks are going to be like all about this shit. Unionism, taxation, workers.
Union organizer over here, baby.
Worker organization, relationships to capital, size of government properly, conceived. It's all going to be ripe for this sort of discussion. It's a little misplaced right now, so I want to move. I want to move us forward. We can all look forward to.
This is just pregame for that.
It's a little bit of a pregame. That's right. So Madison wins, right? We know that Cato loses. Madison wins, Cato loses, but the anti-federalist tradition, it doesn't die. It lives on in Jefferson, and it lives on today. But let's look at Jefferson, and then we can talk about how it lives on today. So Jefferson, he's in favor of the Constitution, with the addition of the Bill of Rights. But he's not as convinced as Hamilton and Madison that the Constitution conduced perfectly to the spirit of liberty. So he's in favor of its adoption in a sort of circumstantial sort of respect. He's like, yeah, for right now, this is great. But he's gonna have a lot of sort of qualifications that we're gonna take a look at. But so to understand Jefferson's unique position, we need to understand his unique definition of republicanism, which combines ancient and modern definitions. And it's a much better definition than Madison gives. Madison sort of confuses democracy and republicanism. He tries to separate them when it's not really clear if that's the appropriate distinction. But Jefferson is really really clear in his ideas here. And so let's take a look at Jefferson's letters.
Hey, Brent, I'm sorry, dude. I actually have to work with a guy right now.
Yeah, you have horrible quality anyway, so peep the recording. So anyway, so indeed, so this is what Jefferson says. He says, indeed, it must be acknowledged that the term republic is a very vague application in every language. We're going to be done in like 15 minutes, everybody else. Witness the self-styled republics of Holland, Switzerland, Genoa, Venice, Poland. Were I to assign this term a precise and definite idea, I would say, purely and simply, it means a government by its citizens en masse, acting directly and personally according to rules established by the majority, and that every other government is more or less republican in proportion as it has in its composition more or less of this ingredient of the direct action of its citizens. Such a government is evidently restrained to very narrow limits of space and population. I doubt if it would be practical beyond the extent of the New England township. Do you guys have any connection with the New England Township? Does that ring any, like, does that like is anybody from New England? I don't think any of you guys are. None of you guys are. I know that Maverick went to New England and he thought it was really cool the way that they live over there. But anyway, so Jefferson here sort of gives a definition of republicanism that may seem familiar to us. We might think of it as a direct democracy. Isn't that kind of how we would think of direct democracy? It's like the direct action of its citizens. A government by its citizens acting directly and personally. Like you yourself go to the town hall. That's what Jefferson has in mind with republicanism. That's sort of distinct than, there's like all these debates now. It's like, oh, we're a republic, not a democracy, right? Like you kind of hear that as like a cudgel to like, whenever somebody's complaining about the like anti-democratic nature of the Constitution or of the election or something like that, you usually get some sort of like, oh, well, we're a republic. It's designed to be that way. It's designed to be not democratic. But Jefferson tells us something completely different here. But the question is like, so, it's key that the direct action of its citizens is important to Jefferson. So the question is how to keep direct action alive in a modern extended republic. So we gave up the idea of the New England Township, but how do we like make alive this idea of direct action? And Jefferson
Brian,
has.
I got to take off. I'm about to board my flight. This was
no
really
worries.
great, and I'm sorry I have to leave early.
That's
but
okay.
I'll
No
talk
worries.
to you
No
guys
worries.
soon.
No worries.
All right.
But so what Jefferson has in mind is the ward system. And so by the ward system, what he has in mind is associated with the schools. The schools are the starting point, but I wonder if I could, oh, it's actually right here. Yeah, the ward system. And he says, divide the counties into wards of such size as that every citizen can attend when called on and act in person. Ascribe to them the government of their wards and all things relating to themselves exclusively. A justice chosen by themselves in each. A constable, a military company, a patrol, a school, the care of their own poor, their own portion of the public roads, the choice of one or more jurors to serve in some court, and the delivery with their own wards of their own votes for all elective officers of a higher sphere. Will relieve the county administration of nearly all its business, will have it better done, and by making every citizen an acting member of the government and in the offices nearest and most interesting to him, will attach to him by his strongest feelings to the independence of his country and its Republican Constitution. So this is all to say that he wants all of us to live in these small towns and have ownership of that town. Have each of us have a sort of equal say in what goes on in that town, an equal responsibility for its proper functioning. And so this is his idea of the ward system. That's what he has in mind with the wards. Is like we would all sort of, and we would be embodied within our own political body, right? Like we would be a part of the sort of like local political body. We wouldn't have a sort of private, a solely private life. We would each be public people. And this would both make our public spaces better, right? It would make our political realities more conducive to our lives, but it'll also improve ourselves in some respect, in the same way that Aristotle says that sort of thing does. And so he says, so some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence. Oh, well, so actually I should introduce this quote. So he wants us to live in wards, but the reason why he's sort of ambiguous about his support of the Constitution, the reason why he's okay with it being ratified, but he's not as on board with it as Hamilton and Madison, is because he thinks it's going to be only good for us for a short period of time. And what he wants more than that, he wants every generation to be a part of its own constitution making. He wants every generation to have a say in what the public life looks like, in what political life looks like. And so this quote here is some of my, it's from the same letter. I got it from this letter we were looking at, but I've just pulled it out because I think it's nicer to look at this way. But he says this. He says some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human and suppose what they did to be beyond amendment. Laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind, he says. And then he'll continue that in a bit. But what does he have in mind? So when he says they ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human, don't we ascribe to Jefferson maybe sometimes? But, perhaps more, or perhaps equally to Madison and Hamilton and Washington. Don't we sort of like hold them in sanctimonious reverence for what they've done and what they've given to us? And we've ascribed to these men a wisdom that is more than human. And he says laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, the human mind, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made and opinions change with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also and keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. So what is he saying here? What does this all have, like, what is this? What does he have in mind? Remember, he's writing a letter to his friend here about what? Well, I put it in the title here. He's talking about the Constitution, right? And he's saying, look, guys, you folks that are coming generations after me, do not fall in love with the Constitution.
Yeah, he knows that it's like fallible,
Yes.
like at its core.
Yes. And not only that, he knows that even if it was perfect, the perfect document that they could make at the time, he knows that in 20 years, the people it's going to be governing are going to be different. And not only that, the people that it's governing are going to want to have their own input into it. And that's a part of like what makes a full human life, is to decide for yourself how you are governed, is to find yourself in your own governance. And I think he says more about this in the next slide. He says, each generation is as independent as the one preceding. It has then, like them, a right to choose for itself the form of government it believes most promotive of happiness. So what he says here is that we fell in love. We, the American revolutionaries, we fell in love with revolution. We fell in love with self-governance. We found ourselves in forming a government. I do not want my descendants to not know that freedom and not know that joy. They should have that as well, because I was able to be a full person. I do not want to enchain my future descendants with my own frailties and my own failures that I've put into this document that I've given them. So he's saying to us, have confidence. Don't be afraid to throw off the chains of your barbarous ancestors. Do something of yourself, right? And in particular, actually, precisely, he tells us to do this every 19 or 20 years. He says, it is for the peace and good of mankind that a solemn opportunity of doing this every 19 or 20 years should be provided by the Constitution, so that it may be handed on with periodical repairs from generation to generation to the end of time. That the best Constitution, the one that I wanted to write, the one that we should have written, had in its language the ability and the sort of mandate for everybody to get together every 20 years and write a new one and figure out what would be best for themselves. And so this is like Jefferson's like lasting like thoughts, is like, it wasn't that like we did a great job and I love doing it, but like I want the next generation to do it themselves too.
Isn't it, I mean, do you find it ironic that most people that would like put Jefferson and the founding fathers on like a
Pedestal.
angelic pedestal of divineness or whatever I'm trying to say, right? Like also hold so dear like the importance of keeping the Constitution
Yeah.
identical to what it was, despite the same guy writing like, hey, you should revise this like as you go.
Irony is the right word.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
that's, that's the whole point. That's what I wanted to get out of this, is to show the irony of this.
It's wild. Ironic is
Yeah.
like the only word I can.
Well, so the question, I guess the question, and then we can end on this question, is that a good idea? Is it a good idea to have a new constitution every 20 years? What's the downside of that?
I mean, I'll happily weigh in there. I
Yeah.
mean, I can't. It's like if we look at, I think about this weirdly quite often, like the idea of writing a modern constitution today. And I just don't think we could do it with the number of like political interests involved in politics today. Like, is politics today compared to what it was in 1776? Is it really about the good of the people anymore? I'd go as far as arguing that, and like through that lens, I have a hard time believing people could band together to write a doctrine that promotes the good of the people. Which is quite pessimistic view. I would definitely admit that.
No, but it's sort of safeguard, it is a rather conservative view, but it's one that says something like, look, it's a fairly good constitution that we have. If we throw it out and start a new one, we might end up with the United States of Walmart or of Coke Industries or something like that. And like, I'm kind of sympathetic to that concern.
Yeah.
Brondo's got what plants crave. It's got electrolytes.
Yeah, right, exactly.
The United States of Walmart. I mean, I don't think we're far off from that as it is. So I
true.
think like if like I think we would almost need imprinted safeguards to rewrite the Constitution.
Yeah, I think that's what he has in mind, because he says like, look, it should be provided by the Constitution. You have the Constitution and it has some safeguards in there, but there's also like all this other stuff of like around it that we can change every few years,
When was,
yeah.
a random question then, when was the last amendment that was, that came up on my mind because I saw that Gavin
Oh, yeah,
just
yeah, yeah, yeah,
promoted the
yeah.
24th, the gun one that he just announced today.
I don't know. I'm embarrassed to say that I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, I feel like because I actually fully agree with Jeff. I don't think it's pessimistic. I think it's realistic view of like, it'd be really hard to write one, but if I were to advocate for what Jefferson said and how we have adhered to that, it would be the amendments, right? But that's why I was curious, when was the last one even ratified? Because I don't even know. I don't know how
It's
often that
very
ever
hard.
happens.
Right. It's very hard to
exactly.
do it. There's 27. I'm so embarrassed. Yeah.
I think you're
It's,
right. I think you're right. Yeah. Because I think it was the 28th that was on the video I saw.
Yeah. And like, famously, we can't even get an equal rights amendment passed for like women, like we can't do like the basic things that you would want to do to like
That's actually really sad.
to like shore up like the document from, the 1800s. Like we can't get the very basic. It's so hard to make an amendment essentially. And like, and the amendment process is not what Jefferson has in mind as far as getting together every 20 years. Like he has in mind like having a rousing debate and like figuring out what our principles are and like,
Yeah. And of course, when he wrote that, there
yeah.
weren't 320 million people in the country either. So
That's true. Right. Well, so that was a lot of fun. We can end it here, but this is, I think the students always really love that lecture about how Jefferson was sort of humble in his own estimation or whatever about the Constitution, and how we sort of like, yeah, I think Jeff has it right where he says, we sort of sanctify these figures, the same people that sort of hold the founders of the country and the revolutionaries in on a pedestal are the same people that say that the Constitution is like holy writ, when Jefferson is really clear-eyed about his own admission of failures, but also just like he wants to make sure that we know the joys of revolution that he knew. And I think that's like the sort of two-pronged reasons why we should do Constitution. One, the one that he wrote might not be good enough. And second, there's just something like human about deciding how you're going to be governed. And you shouldn't just accept what was given to you, the arrangement sort of given to you. You should be a part of that decision-making process. So anyway, that we're going to end there. Next week will be fun. And then I'm really excited for the next few weeks because you guys all seem to always want to talk about economics. And I think that's where we're going to end up. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Cool.
Thank
Thanks.
This is
you.
awesome, man.
Thanks, Jeff, for coming. That was
Bye.
cool.
Yeah, thanks for having me.